And feel free to ask me to annotate this if you would like that. So welcome to class, guys. We're here on Thursday, October 21st. We're going over chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system, right before your next lecture exam. So we're at the end of module 2 already. You have a lot of things due this weekend. So we have, I gave you another PhysioX lab to do. Submit there. Make sure you only do the activities that I ask you for, and they're in the directions. And then you have your lab exam. Your lab exam will be on labs 1 through 7. And your lab exam, I posted an announcement to give you some study tips. Basically, your study tips say that if it's when you're studying the PhysioX labs, I'm basically just reviewing or kind of picking questions from the pre and post lab sections. And then the Labster labs, I tried to keep the questions not very broad, but very easy. I shouldn't say easy because you guys probably don't think they are, but something you would have seen in lecture and in other labs. And then if it was a specific kind of something I wanted you guys to focus on, I think I even posted in the announcement, kind of specifically look at a couple of key items. It's 50 points, but it's not 50 questions. Many of the questions are worth more than 1 point. And I give you guys a whole hour to do it. If you're a DSPS student, you guys should see your extra time for the lab exam and for the lecture exam. You have a case study due. That's been hopefully something you've been able to work on this whole month. The lab exam opens tonight at midnight, and then you guys can work on everything else. The only thing that you can't do ahead of time is this lecture exam, and that will be open on Tuesday, the 26th. So we'll do the same thing. I have it open on Tuesday, the 26th at 6:30 p.m. It's open for your allotted time. So try to start it at close to 6:30 as you can. And if you cannot, let me know. So that'll be the lecture exam. So next Tuesday, we won't meet for class. You guys will do this exam via Proctorio. And again, you notice I don't offer study guides, but as I've been lecturing, I can't promise you I've covered everything, but I've tried to kind of focus your studying on things I want you to look at. Along with that, as I think I covered all the announcements, as we jump into our final chapter, I also shortened this PowerPoint and I'm focusing on the slides that I want you guys to focus on. And this is your autonomic nervous system. And this system will end our nervous system discussion. I'm sure you guys are ready to be done with the nervous system. And this is an interesting system because these are all things that happen underneath your conscious control. The lab exam is using Proctorio as well. Yes, Victoria, good question. So your autonomic nervous system consists of motor neurons that innervate smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands. It makes adjustments to ensure for optimal support for body activities. It will shunt the blood to the areas that need it, like your muscles if you need to run fast, or your gut if you're trying to digest. And it will also adjust your heart rate, your blood pressure, your digestive processes. And again, this all operates under subconscious control. So you don't even know, you can't control when this happens. If you're getting really nervous and anxious as you're taking an exam, your autonomic nervous system is kicking into gear your sympathetic system. It's also called your involuntary nervous system or your general visceral motor system. So remember, visceral means organs. So this is a system that controls your organs, but the motor response. So again, in the division and organization of your peripheral nervous system, we're down here on the autonomic side of things. So we're in the motor division section. The somatic nervous system went to all skeletal muscles that you control, and autonomic nervous system is involuntarily controlled subconsciously. We divide your autonomic nervous system into a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division. And that's what we're going to focus on a lot in this chapter. And in these 44 or 45 slides, you should know very well the differences that happen to your body under sympathetic control versus parasympathetic control. And we'll go through those. So your autonomic nervous system versus your somatic nervous system, first of all, both have motor fibers. but they differ in their effectors, their efferent pathways, and the ganglia, meaning how they connect to other neurons to get to the effectors. They also differ in their target organ responses to neurotransmitters. So your somatic nervous system innervates your skeletal muscles, and the ANS, autonomic nervous system, innervates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and all of your glands. So the efferent pathways and ganglia, and again, this is describing the pathways from the brain down to the effector, either the organ or the skeletal muscle that it's innervating. In the somatic nervous system, the cell body is in your central nervous system, so the brain or spinal cord, and you have one single thick myelinated group A axon that extends in the spinal or cranial nerves directly to the skeletal muscle. And we know that because we talked about the neuromuscular junction. We know that these motor neurons go directly to the skeletal muscle, the effector that they innervate. In the autonomic nervous system, they use a 2-neuron chain, a preganglionic neuron, where the cell body in the central nervous system with a very thin, lightly myelinated, what we call preganglionic axon, extending to a ganglion. And a ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Then after that ganglion, we have like a connection to another neuron that's called the postganglionic neuron. And this will always be outside your central nervous system. So the cell body will synapse with the preganglionic axon in the autonomic ganglion with non-myelinated postganglionic axon that extends to the effector organ. I don't know if I ask you detailed details about the efferent pathways, but I do just want you to know the difference that your somatic nervous system, the axon of the neuron goes right to the skeletal muscle, but in your autonomic nervous system, we kind of have this pathway of preganglionic to postganglionic neuron. Somatic nervous system, they all release acetylcholine from in the neuromuscular junction, that's the neurotransmitter released. And the effect is always stimulatory, meaning that acetylcholine will stimulate a muscle contraction. In the autonomic nervous system, we have some different transmitters. Preganglionic fibers can release acetylcholine. Postganglionic fibers will release norepinephrine or acetylcholine at the effector, organ or gland. And the effect can either stimulate or inhibit that organ or gland, depending on the type of receptor. We have higher brain centers that regulate and coordinate both of these systems. Most of your spinal and many of your cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers, and adaptations usually involve both skeletal muscles and visceral organs. So for example, an active muscle requires more oxygen and glucose if you're exercising, let's say. So your autonomic nervous system will kind of work to speed up the heart rate and open airways to get more oxygen and glucose to that muscle. So both kind of systems work at the same time. So here we just have some differences, again, between the somatic nervous system with a single neuron releasing a neurotransmitter that innervates an effector organ. That effect is stimulatory. Whereas in the autonomic system, we have this 2-neuron pathway, a pre- and postganglionic neuron, releasing usually acetylcholine at the first junction. And at the second junction, as it's connected to its effector, with whether that's a gland, a smooth muscle, it can release acetylcholine or norepinephrine, and it can stimulate or inhibit that organ. And then this is the important part. So the 2 divisions now of the autonomic nervous system are parasympathetic and sympathetic. Your parasympathetic division promotes the maintenance, functions, and conserves energy. So your parasympathetic division helps your body rest and digest. So after eating a big meal, as you're resting, your parasympathetic division is shunting all blood to your gut to help with digestive processes. The sympathetic division mobilizes the body during an activity and gets the body ready for a fight or flight response. So anything that can raise your heart rate, playing in the championship basketball game, about to take your physiology exam, anything else that gets your body really nervous, excited, emotional, raising your heart rate, dilating your pupils, That's all sympathetic division. And you should know, again, very well, I would say at least 5 questions on your exam just have to do with what your body does if its parasympathetic division is kicking into gear or the sympathetic division is kicking into gear. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this PowerPoint. Dual innervation means that all your visceral organs are served by both divisions, but these divisions cause an opposite effect. So we have what we call a dynamic antagonism between 2 divisions that maintains homeostasis. So for example, if your sympathetic division is raising your heart rate to beat rapidly to get you ready to run a race, to pump more blood to your muscles that need that oxygen, if it's starting to pump it too high, the parasympathetic division will come into gear and slow it down. So we have this dynamic antagonism that helps to maintain a homeostasis. So your parasympathetic division, it keeps the body energy use as low as possible while carrying out maintenance activities like digestion, diuresis, defecation. It's referred to your rest and digest division system. So for example, a person relaxing and reading after a meal, their blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rates will be low. Their GI tract activity is high, and the pupils will be constricted and the lenses will be accommodated for close vision. And that's because when you're resting, you're digesting, your pupils are going to constrict because they don't need to be wide open, because they don't need to be taking in light from all of the surroundings, because your body's just resting and digesting. The sympathetic division gets your body ready for an activity. It's referred to the fight or flight system. So exercise, excitement, and emergency, embarrassment, these will all activate the sympathetic system. So your heart rate will increase, you will have a dry mouth, you'll get cold, sweaty skin, and your pupils will dilate in an effort to, in an emergency situation, you want to take in as much of your surroundings as possible. During a very vigorous physical activity, it will shunt blood to your skeletal muscles and your heart. It will dilate your bronchioles. So dilate means the diameter of your bronchioles, which are divisions of your trachea that go to your lungs. So it's the air pathway to your lungs. The bronchioles will get larger in diameter to increase the flow of oxygen to your lungs. And that allows for the oxygen delivery to get eventually to your skeletal muscles that need it. And it also causes the liver to release glucose, because your cells will need glucose to turn into ATP or energy during various activities. So if you study just these 2 slides, this one, slide 11 and slide 12, you could probably answer at least 2 or 3 questions on your lecture exam. Some key anatomical differences. So there's different sites of origin for these sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, and this is also important to know. So the parasympathetic fibers are craniosacral, meaning the fibers that control the parasympathetic division will originate in the brain and in the sacral division of the spinal cord. So we call the parasympathetic fibers cranial-sacral, and the sympathetic fibers are what we call thoracocolumnar, because they originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. There might be one question about this, asking you about a fiber coming out of which area of the spinal cord. Is it parasympathetic or is it sympathetic? And I'll show a picture of that in a second too. There's relative lengths of the fibers. I don't ask you guys to know this, but parasympathetic has long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers, and sympathetic is opposite. The location of the ganglia, which ganglia again are clusters of cell bodies of neurons. The parasympathetic ganglia are located in or near the visceral effector organ, and the sympathetic ganglia lie close to the spinal cord. And that's where we get this sympathetic trunk idea. So let's look at parasympathetic first. So this is your craniosacral division, because the fibers from these neurons innervate or originate in the cranial region and the sacral region of the spinal cord. And again, the parasympathetic division gets the body ready for resting and digesting, conserving energy. The sympathetic division fibers originate in the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. And you can see here that their ganglia are in this sympathetic trunk. And I don't know if you remember from anatomy, but that sympathetic trunk, you could kind of see like a ladder running parallel to your spinal cord, and it holds the ganglia, or cell bodies, of these sympathetic nerve fibers. And again, so these are the fibers that will get the body ready in these various organs I show here for fighting or flighting, running away, or getting your body ready for activity. But the fibers themselves originate in the thoracolumbar region, so between T1 and L3 about. So you should know kind of where those fibers originate from the spinal cord. This is just kind of some key anatomical differences, giving you the origin of the parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers. So then we go into a little more detail. The parasympathetic division is the craniosacral division because the fibers originate from the brainstem and the sacral regions of the cord. And again, their ganglia are close or within the target organs. And again, that is shown here. The cell bodies are located in the brainstem. Specifically for the cranial part, we have preganglionic fibers running in the oculomotor nerves, which will help to cause pupil constriction and the lenses to bulge for focusing. Because you're parasympathetic, again, the pupils will constrict during parasympathetic activity. Facial nerves will stimulate large glands in the head. So the parasympathetic division gets your body ready for digesting. So it'll stimulate saliva, some of these salivary glands. And that just shows the facial and glossopharyngeal nerves and how they're part of that parasympathetic division. Vagus nerves. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, accounts for about 90% of all preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. You don't really need to know all of this part, but the vagus nerve is where a lot of parasympathetic fibers will originate from as well, because it will go into the cardiac plexus. It will slow your heart rate down. It will go to your pulmonary plexus to constrict your bronchioles because you don't need as much air coming in when you're just resting and digesting. And then it will have branches that go to your GI tract. And then the sacral region, you have pelvic splanchnic nerves, ganglia on the pelvic floor that also go to the urinary bladder, ureters, reproductive organs. So this takes you through the parasympathetic division. You don't necessarily need to know all the organs that fibers will innervate. I just want you in general to know what the parasympathetic division gets your body ready for. Resting, digesting, pupils constrict, heart rate slows down, blood is shunted to the GI tract, bronchioles will constrict because you don't need as much airflow going into the lungs. Then the sympathetic division is more complex and it innervates more organs. Some structures are innervated only by the sympathetic, like sweat glands, erector pili muscles, smooth muscles of all your blood vessels, because the smooth muscles of all your blood vessels might dilate to allow blood to get to a certain part of the body that needs it, like muscles. And again, the sympathetic fibers originate in the thoracolumbar division. They form the lateral horns of the spinal cord. So here we have sympathetic division. The fibers originate between T1 and the L3 of the spinal cord. This shows where preganglionic fibers pass through different communicantes and then enter that sympathetic trunk where their ganglia are located. These are the 23 paravertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk. So that, again, that sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk runs parallel along either side of the vertebral column. And these are where the ganglia, our cell bodies, are located for these sympathetic nerve fibers. Sympathetic division, I'm going to kind of pass over this slide, the synapse in the trunk ganglia and the synapse in the collateral ganglia. I don't really ask you guys for. Sympathetic pathways, so these are more pathways. Postganglionic axons will then enter ventral rami via gray rami communicants. Remember, if you think about it, and I think I show, I'm just going to go right to this picture right away. So if you remember that here's the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and here's the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And remember that all sensory information goes into the dorsal root side of the spinal nerve. So sensory information comes through the dorsal root ganglia into the dorsal root and into the spinal cord itself. All motor information goes out the ventral root. So this is just showing the pathway of sympathetic innervation. Sympathetic nervous system is a motor response to an organ or a gland. So it's going to come out of the ventral root because that's a motor response. And this just shows you kind of how it synapses in the ganglia using different what we call communicans or communicants as it kind of curves its way around and synapses in the ganglia. So you don't necessarily need to know all about the communicants and communicans, but understanding well, just again, that all sensory information comes in the dorsal root and ventral or motor information goes out to the front or the ventral root. And again, this just shows, again, it basically is showing how the synapse can happen at a ganglia at a higher or a lower level. And then it will go on to innervate the effector. Pathways to the head, fibers will emerge from T1 to T4. Again, these are showing pathways. I don't ask you guys a lot of questions about pathways, but I include these slides because what I want you to focus on, not necessarily understanding the pathway, but this is what I want you to focus on is what do these fibers do? This is the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. These fibers will innervate skin and blood vessels of the head. They'll stimulate dilator muscles of the iris to dilate the pupil. It will inhibit nasal and salivary glands because it's inhibiting digestion, and it's innervating smooth muscles of the upper eyelid. And it also has a branch to the heart, which will increase the heart rate. More fibers from T1 to T6. You need to know which fibers that is, but again, we have fibers innervating the heart to increase your heart rate, the thyroid gland, the skin to stimulate some hormone release, as well as sweating, and also to the lungs and the esophagus. So lungs to dilate the bronchioles to get more airflow through the lungs, and to the esophagus probably just to slow down any sort of digestion or swallowing that's occurring. So again, you need to know where the fibers originate in the thoracolumbar region. You don't need to know exactly the pathway that they go on, but I do want you to know what the sympathetic division does to all of these organs and glands and what the parasympathetic does to all of these organs and glands. And again, really simply put, the sympathetic division gets your body ready for stressful situations, emergencies, fight or flight, and the parasympathetic division gets your body ready for resting and digesting, conserving energy. Then we get to some visceral reflexes. So visceral sensory neurons send information about chemical changes, stretch, temperature, and any irritation of the visceral, which are your organs. And these receptors for visceral senses are free nerve endings that are widely scattered throughout all your viscera, throughout all your organs. The cell bodies are located in dorsal root ganglia and in sensory ganglia cranial nerves. The axons travel in the same nerves as your autonomic motor fibers as they monitor conditions of organs serviced by your autonomic nervous system fibers. So basically what this is saying is you have sensory neurons on your viscera, on your organs, that are constantly sensing that your autonomic nervous system is making the right changes to the heart or the gut or your eyes or the bronchioles. These visceral sensory neurons can converge on the same second order sensory neurons that receive input from somatic sensory neurons, so play also a role in referred pain. And I think we kind of talked about referred pain a little bit, but that just means that because these neurons kind of converge on the same sensory neurons that lead that information to the brain. For example, your heart, for example, if you're going through a heart attack, the same sensory neurons that are coming from the whole left side of the arm travel in that same neuron pathway as the sensory neurons from your heart. So pain from a heart attack could be referred or deferred to the left arm. Visceral reflexes, I include reflexes a little more because understanding reflexes, I just have a couple questions, but you should know, we talked about the reflexes of the somatic reflex arcs a little bit, and the visceral reflex arcs have the same components that you should know. They all have a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integration center, a motor neuron, an effector, but there's a couple differences. The visceral reflex arc, and again, so visceral, if we think about reflex arcs where you hit your knee with a hammer, that's a somatic reflex arc. Visceral reflex arcs are sensing information about your organs. They will all have 2 consecutive neurons in the motor pathway. The afferent fibers will be visceral sensory neurons, meaning that they will only sense information from organs. And then the effectors will always go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands rather than skeletal muscle. So again, just a visceral reflex. It's still a reflex, but it happens under subconscious control, and you can't control it at all, and it's not going to skeletal muscles. So one example or a couple examples of a visceral reflex are reflexes that empty the rectum and the bladder. You have 3 neuron reflex arcs that exists in the walls of the GI tract, and these involve the enteric nervous system. In the enteric nervous system, we didn't get to it all. You don't need to know this, but it's kind of a division of the nervous system that's just for your GI tract. So we'll end kind of with these couple of slides talking about visceral reflexes. You should know the general components of a visceral reflex. And again, we have some sort of receptor in the viscera in an organ. So let's just say we have a receptor in the bladder, which is noticing that the bladder is stretching because it's filling up with urine. That visceral sensory neuron will bring that information through the dorsal root ganglia, the sensory side. We'll have an integration center, and then we'll have some sort of motor neuron response, which will be a 2-neuron chain that kind of does this loop-de-loop, and what they're called these communicants with these autonomic ganglia. And then we'll have some sort of visceral response or effector. And in terms of the bladder, it will empty the bladder, and that's a visceral reflex. We control when urine leaves the body because there's a sphincter at the opening to the urethra that's under voluntary control. So even though your bladder went empty, you still are controlling how or when the urine leaves the body. This talks about how most visceral organs have dual intervention between nerve fibers from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. And this just means that action potentials are continually firing down axons of both divisions, producing again what we call a dynamic antagonistic interaction. And that just means that your sympathetic division is working to raise your heart rate, while the parasympathetic division is trying to lower the heart rate. And we kind of have them both firing at the same time to keep our heart rate in a normal homeostatic range. And they work very precisely to control all visceral activity. Both A and S divisions are partially active, resulting in what we call a sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. One division usually predominates, but in a few cases, divisions have a cooperative effect. Dynamic antagonism allows for very precise control of visceral activity, like the heart rate, for example. So for example, your sympathetic division, again, this is a great slide to review the differences as well. Sympathetic division will increase the heart and respiratory rate, but inhibit digestion and elimination. And the parasympathetic division will decrease the heart and respiratory rates while allowing for digestion and discarding of wastes. So they're antagonistic. They're both innervating the same organs, but they're doing opposite things to the organs. But that's really good in our bodies, because then our body has a way of controlling. It's kind of like our body's fail-safe mechanism. Our heart rate will never get too high because our parasympathetic division will always come in to decrease the heart rate and respiratory rate, and so on. Unique roles of the sympathetic division, other unique functions. So you can read through some of these unique roles. Thermoregulatory responses to heat. When body temperature rises, your sympathetic nerves dilate your skin blood vessels, allowing heat to escape, activating sweat glands. And when body temperatures drop, these blood vessels will constrict. Release of renin from the kidneys. Your sympathetic system also causes the release of renin from the kidneys. That in turn activates a system that increases blood pressure. That's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And we'll talk about that when we get to some of your hormones. And then metabolic effects, your sympathetic nervous system will increase the metabolic rate of cells. What that means, if you increase the metabolic rate of the cells, you're increasing the way, or you're making it go faster, turning glucose into energy. And it makes sense. Your sympathetic nervous system would want to make that go faster to try to make more and more energy for your muscle cells to use for contracting. It raises blood glucose levels to get glucose into the blood for cells to use. And it also mobilizes fats for use as fuels. Localized versus diffuse effects. Parasympathetic division tends to elicit much more short-lived and highly localized control over the effectors. And the sympathetic division tends to be longer lasting with kind of whole body-wide effects. You can kind of see how your sympathetic uses norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones. They have prolonged effects that last even after the sympathetic signals might stop. And then this is kind of a final division and a good summary of basically, again, if you just study this one slide, you could probably answer at least 3 to 4 questions from the exam on Tuesday. So it goes through the target organ or the system, and then what the effect is from the parasympathetic side and what the effect is from the sympathetic side. So use this slide to kind of review if you're still a little confused about that. But that brings us to the end of this slide. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording and then answer any questions from people who are still here.